they fail it, and they come back to you for retraining, you sign them back off again, and they fail it again, do you take a third chance?
Mr. Brown, we recently did an episode about when it might be advisable to fire your CFI, your flight instructor. Now, you're a flight instructor. I'm a flight instructor. We've both been doing this a long time. I love being a flight instructor, but there are times when a CFI might want to think about firing their student, because this job does come with a significant amount of responsibility, and we have to impart knowledge, but we can't force it into somebody's head and hands. Would you be, can we get a consensus on that? That sometimes there are rare instances where a CFI might want to shed themselves of a student who's not performing.
Well, you mentioned responsibility, Jamie, but with responsibility also comes the risk.
Oh, yeah.
And CFIing is not without a significant amount of risk. What if you've signed somebody off for a check ride and that person fails, and you retrain them and you're absolutely confident that they're going to nail it, and they fail it again? What's the risk to you and your career if you take them on a third time and they fail?
I think that's something that's not well understood, that the student not successfully completing a check ride does reflect on the CFI.
It absolutely does. We were having a one of the mandatory meetings that examiners have to have with their local FSDOs every year. It's in the guidance. Every year we have to have a mandatory meeting, and I think there were 15 or 16 of us in the room, not including the FSDO guys. And this subject came up, and the FSDO guys have access to the pass fail rate of every CFI out there. And, the conventional wisdom is 80%. That's what it takes to renew by activity over a 2-year period, five recommendations and 3 passes. Goal seal is 10 recommendations and 8 passes in the past 2 years. But the question I often get asked, is well, when do they start looking at my pass fail record? And the answer, near as I can tell, is that there's no set number, or maybe a better way to put that is there's no like calendar reminder at the FSDO, go look at the pass fail records of the CFIs in the area. There isn't anything like that. But if something happens to trigger something like that, where they're looking at an individual CFI's pass fail record, at least at our local FSDO, 70% seems to be kind of a number of interest. I'll just put it that way. If a CFI is showing a 70% pass rate, or looking at the other way, a 30% fail rate,
Mm-hmm.
that could trigger some sort of reevaluation or reexamination. I'm not saying it will, and the FSDO is quick to say that doesn't mean it will happen, but it could.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason this discussion, and you suggested this topic, and I appreciate it. This discussion is really valuable for CFIs, especially relatively new CFIs that don't have a lot of experience, but it's also got value to a student, because this all comes down to don't be that student. There are things you can do to be successful, and there are things that you can do that really will prevent you from being successful. One of the biggies for me is if you've got a student who shows up habitually unprepared. They've done no prep for this lesson. They didn't watch any videos. They didn't read. They didn't do any chair flying. They really are completely unprepared to do what we came to do today. The likelihood of being successful on that lesson goes down dramatically.
Yeah, and something, life gets in the way. It's old cliche, but it's true. Life gets in the way, and there may be legitimate reasons why a student shows up unprepared for a lesson once in a while. But when it's chronicle, yeah. We talk about these are your rent. I'm using your rented lips today, Jamie.
I'm
Uh,
sending you a thesaurus. I swear I am.
yeah, please do, please do. Isn't that? Didn't they die out with the Big Bang?
Yes, they did.
The
They did.
thesauruses.
Yeah, it was a comet of Gulf of Mexico. It was a big thing.
That's what I thought. I remember reading that somewhere. Anyway, now I've forgotten. When they habitually end up consistently, chronically, is what I was trying to say, chronically late or unprepared, really. Man, at some point you just have to say, okay, you know something, we're not going to fly today. We're going to sit down here, and I'm just going to have to force feed this stuff to you. And of course, that's counterproductive. The instructor doesn't get to log the time, which is important for them if they're looking for somewhere down the road. But more importantly, it's a waste of the student's money just because he or she didn't take the time to look at that video or to read that reading assignment or what have you. So yeah,
Well, and that lack of preparation translates into check ride day where you have to be prepared. There's no CFI there to help you. And beyond that, if you successfully pass your check ride, you're now a pilot and you can fly as PIC. Showing up for any flight unprepared raises the level of risk. That's not great. So it's a habit we need to establish early on in training. I'm the student or learner, as the FAA now says for some ridiculous reason. You're my CFI. You give me guidance, but I have to come in ready to perform. And if I can't do that, that's going to be a problem long term.
it is, and it does trickle downhill. Yesterday afternoon, we were getting ready to do the oral, excuse me, on a commercial check ride, and the paperwork was not right. There were significant logbook issues. Now we were able to get them resolved, but it took about an hour and 15 minutes, maybe an hour 20, to just get the logbook issues required. Everything else was fine, but unprepared because they hadn't properly vetted the logbooks. And this is not just the student's fault. The instructor certainly has a responsibility of helping that, making sure that gets done right. But nonetheless, it goes back to the unprepared situation.
And the next one for me, and I was this student very early on because I didn't understand this. I had never been in flight training. I didn't know anybody who had been in flight training. I would get busy and I wouldn't keep good track of my calendar and I would cancel or even no show periodically. That's really bad because the instructor has blocked out time to serve me and I didn't show up. That's a real problem. And I did have a discussion with a flight instructor. They explained that to me and I'm like, oh, I'm an adult. I should keep my schedule better.
Flight instructors are like doctors and lawyers and any other professional, and their only asset is time. Knowledge, of course, but their real asset that they're selling is their time to be able to impart that knowledge to you. So if you book their time and you don't show, it's really a sign of disrespect.
Yeah. And, I think this is a misconception as well. An add on to that. If my flight is scheduled for 10 a.m., don't show up at 10 a.m. Show up at
Right.
9:30. Show up at 8:45. Have some time to get prepared. You can go do the pre-flight. You've got time for that pre-flight brief. You can use your time a lot better. But if you are consistently showing up on the dot or even a few minutes later, that's really going to be a problem in your training.
My dad always used to say, if you're on time, you're late. If you're
I
15
think I
minutes
like your
early,
dad.
you're on time. So, and it's true. It's true. I really do try to live by that. If I've got an appointment at X o'clock, whatever it might be, I really do try to get there, whether it's CFI or DPE or whatever. Not always successful, but my goal is to get there, 10 or 15 minutes early.
You're a good man. I like that. And it may not be well understood in the larger populace, but learning knowledge, gathering knowledge or learning a skill is a collaborative process. It
Indeed.
is necessary for the student to ask questions or to say, Pat, I don't really understand that. Can we go over that again? Because you're
Right.
not using your time well if you're not focusing on issues or lack of understanding. It really is incumbent on the student to communicate clearly with the CFI. Am I not understanding this, or am I just having a problem mastering this? Or do I not understand certain components of this? You've got to communicate with your CFI openly and honestly. And it's okay to say, I don't get it. That's what the CFI is there for, to help you get it.
Yeah, there's got to be an element of trust between both the student and the CFI. The student has to feel like he or she can kind of confess to not getting it without fear of the CFI thinking, "Oh, this person's stupid." And so the trust with the CF with the student is that the CFI won't think that they're stupid. And of course, with the CFI, it's reciprocal. You can't treat the student like they're stupid because they don't get a particular concept.
Sure, it would be natural to not understand this. Flying is not inherent to human beings. It's not a
Yeah.
natural thing. You have to learn it. So the fact that you have gaps in your knowledge is expected. Just say so that the CFI can take corrective action.
Yeah, we're talking about possibility of firing your student, but one of the things that a CFI can do to perhaps head off that likelihood, perhaps because of this particular obstacle, is make sure that they don't end let's say every presentation of a new thing by, "Do you have any questions?" Because the student doesn't want to disappoint the CFI and or look dumb in the eyes of the CFI. So human nature is going to be, "No, I don't have any questions," even though you may be burning with questions. And it kind of comes back to that trust issue. So CFIs should be teaching by asking questions throughout the process to make sure that the student does understand. But at the same time, the student needs to fess up if they don't.
Yeah, and this is something I find interesting. Any CFI flying with any student is likely to miss something somewhere along the line because we're flying with a bunch of people and we may not pick up on something. It's one of the reasons I really like the stage check, which is built into the 141 training program. But there's nothing that stops you from doing it in a Part 61 training program as well, where I fly with your students. Occasionally, you fly with my students, and we see if anything is getting missed. A
Right.
good example of this is years ago, I was doing a stage check on a primary student who came from another instructor, and we were flying in a valley between two ridge lines.
Mm-hmm.
And we were maneuvering and doing all variety of things. And we got into steep turns, ground reference maneuvers, things like that. And the student was drifting over towards the ridge line, and he didn't seem to be aware that there's this large granite wall getting near us. And we're doing a steep turn, and I said, "We're getting too close. I'm uncomfortable with this." So I'm like, "I have the airplane." And he goes, "No, I got it." And I had to kind of sternly say, "No, I have the airplane." And that became a debrief item. And I was actually surprised that the student didn't understand. When the CFI says, "I've got it," that's not a suggestion. There's a safety issue here. I'm taking the airplane. And it was one of those things that, for whatever reason, the student missed with their flight instructor. And when they came to me, it was like, okay, that's something we have to talk about. But
Right.
if you've got a student who just wants to fight you on the controls, "I've got it, I'm in charge," well, that's bad. If you can't fix that in the debrief, maybe that's a student to let go.
Yep. Yeah. You don't want to fly into some granite wall, Jamie. I can understand that. We wouldn't be doing this today.
No.
No, you're absolutely right about that. If you've got a student that's call it anti-authority,
Yeah.
um, that's a really good example of anti-authority right there. That requires some corrective action, and it needs to be effective corrective action, or it's time to fire the student.
Yeah, because that can wander into other aspects. I mean, I can't imagine being on short final where a student's really discombobulated and you say, "I've got it," and they start fighting you over it. That's not going to work out. So it is a debrief item and it is something to talk about. But if that becomes a problem that carries on,
Yeah.
And I have told you the story about the fella I was flying with, who I told him there was opposing traffic, and he just went off screaming and yelling. He was in charge. We did a full stop, and I got out. That's it. We're not flying together anymore. I'm not fighting with you in the cockpit.
No, that's a bad place to be fighting. It's a bad place to be fighting. Yeah.
See, you're just too nice a guy. Nobody would ever do that to you.
Oh, I don't know. I've got stories too many for here. Maybe another time. But one of the things that I see too is especially as an examiner, I see a lot of logbooks. I'll see a half a dozen logbooks in the course of a week or more sometimes. And things that for me that throw up a real red flag are whiteouts or that corrective tape and something written over.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's just a no-no. That just smacks of fraud. It smacks of somebody found something, maybe not enough time. Maybe they were 2 or 3 tenths short on a night flight, or a few miles short on a cross country or something, and now all of a sudden, mysteriously, the destination has been changed or the time has been changed. I have no idea what was below it, and what was underneath the correction. If a correction is going to be made in a logbook, line it out neatly, write in the correction, and if you really want to dot your I's and cross your T's, initial the change. Remember, this is a legal document. It's a legally binding document, the aircraft logbook. And if there's any, if it smacks of fraud of any sort, that's a huge, huge red flag for me. So if you have if the Steve fighters are listening today, if you have a student show up that has a logbook like that, that just looks really, really questionable, man, oh man, I'd be really watching out for that.
I've only had that one time, but it really shook me. I had a student that came to the flight school I was working at from out of state. And his story was that he had done all his training and he was ready to get signed off for his ride, but he had moved to a new state and he just needed to fly with somebody to do that 3 hours to prepare.
Right.
And I look at his logbook, because yes, CFIs look at logbooks. And his
Better.
solo endorsement was, the full endorsement was okay to solo, with an illegible signature and a kind of a hard to read certificate number.
Yeah.
And it just didn't seem right to me. It had no aircraft type, no weather restrictions, nothing. I mean, it's just okay to solo. I've never seen something that sloppy from a CFI. We talked a lot. He was very adamant that he was good. He was ready to go, and he couldn't be held responsible for his prior instructor's endorsements. So we went and flew. It might have been his second flight. He was truly horrible. And
Yeah.
that was one of those things where, okay, this is fraud. You're just trying to skip over everything and you think, oh, I can just do it because it's easy. And that's the kind of thing the CFI actually has a responsibility at that point. If you see unnatural reactions to stress, if you see fraud, if you see somebody trying to circumvent the system, you have a responsibility to intervene at that point. And it's rare, but that's a biggie. We never flew again. That was it. That you're not being honest with me. I can't take responsibility for this.
Yeah, I'll tell you, there was a day that endorsement was enough. When I learned to fly, back when Wilbur and Orville were still adolescents, um, the endorsement for my check ride was ready for the check ride with the instructor's signature. The endorsement for my solo cross countries, okay to solo.
Wow.
That was it. And I can show you my logbook from way back in the dark ages when we were still using papyrus as paper. That's what's in there. So there's no I certify that Joe Smith has blah blah blah, and according to 61 dot blah blah whatever it is. None of that.
Well, and we've talked about this before when we were talking about flight reviews. There's a specific language the FAA wants in the endorsement, and it may be a pre-printed endorsement in your logbook, but that may not be accurate. And that's true of all those pre-printed endorsements. Regulations change. What the FAA wants to see changes over time. It is incumbent on us as CFIs to be up to speed and use the correct thing. And sometimes, folks who have been instructing for a long, long time and maybe not taking that flight instructor refresher course as seriously as they should, that might be an issue. But in this case, I actually think the kid just did it himself. I
Yeah.
honestly don't think he had ever flown.
Yeah, and that very well could be. You know, when we first started this conversation, I mentioned something about multiple failures, and before we do wrap it up, I want to talk a little bit about that. You know, most of the examiners that I know within our local FISDO, and there's, like I said, 15, 16, 17 of us, something like that. Most of us have a personal policy that we won't do a third check ride with a person that's failed the first two. Now, on rare occasions in the last 6 years, I've done that, but my policy as well is, barring any really unusual circumstances, if somebody busts a check ride with me twice, I'm not going to do a third one. It's unfair to the applicant because, as much as I try to stay impartial, and we really do, if I'm going to see somebody for the third time, my thought process is, what's he going to do now? You know, and I hope he passes, but what's he going to do now? But that's from my standpoint. The bigger issue is, what if you're the flight instructor that signed that person off the first time, and he or she fails? Look, it happens. You know, my first time pass rate over all certificates is about 72, 73%. It's not very far off from what the national average sort of is right now. And it fluctuates, but
Mm-hmm.
but if I send somebody back for retraining and the flight instructor retrains them, 99.9% of the time it's fine. And the second time's a slam dunk. They got the extra. It's as flawless a performance as an individual can make normally. But on occasion, and this actually happened just a couple of weeks ago. A guy came to me for the second time because he had bollocksed up his steep turns, and I don't know how it's possible, but it was worse the second time. And it was, man, I hate to do it, but it's just not within the standards. And we went back, and of course the instructor was devastated. And the conversation that I had with her privately afterwards, because she was just at a point of getting ready to go to the airlines. And by the way, an excellent flight instructor, truly excellent flight instructor, really cared about her students, and insisted upon excellence with her students. But for some reason, this person just had a hard time, and I had a conversation with her, and I said, something, the decision that you have to make at this point, because I'm not going to do a third check ride, is, do you want to sign this person off for a third attempt?
Yeah.
Is it 3 strikes you're out, or is it 2 strikes you're out as far as you're the CFI is concerned? I said, this will impact your pass fail rate. I'm not saying that you're going to get reevaluated because you tried to trade this guy 3 times and it didn't work, but it's something you need to think about. And so she actually turned the person over to the chief pilot, who did the final retraining, and the guy passed. But for the CFIs that are watching this, if you've got somebody that's got 2 strikes, you need to really think hard about taking them on for the third strike. You really do.
Yeah, that's a real thing, and I'm with you on that because it does indicate a problem. I'll throw out one other thing that's a modern issue. It's not something that we even thought about when you and I got started in this. It's exclusively, well, I shouldn't say exclusively, but primarily in the post 9/11 world. If you've got a student who just doesn't want to focus on the process, they don't want to do ground reference maneuvers and learn to land and all that. They want to work on aerobatics, or just, this was the 9/11 thing. I don't need to learn how to land. I just want to know how to fly the plane. That's an issue. We have a process, and we have certain things we have to go through before we can solo you. We have things we have to do before we let you go cross country on your own. We have things we have to do to prepare you for your check ride. If the student's not interested in that, that's not probably somebody we want to be devoting a lot of time to. It might even be somebody we want to make a phone call about and say, hey, this is a little weird.
Learning how to fly should be fun. It really should, and a good flight instructor will make it fun. But there are elements of flight training that can be frustrating, that can cut in on the fun, and
I've
you just gotta,
experienced that. Yeah.
we all have. We talked about plateaus in a recent video. Everybody experiences those things, but we got to push through the unfun part so that we can get back to the fun parts. And if you've got somebody that just really is pushing back against doing the work that they have to do to be able to get through the unfun parts, that's a big red flag too.
Well, I hope this conversation is genuinely supportive and helpful to CFIs who might be struggling with a student that they're just not making progress with. And maybe one of these is a reason why. I also hope it's helpful to students to realize, as you say, Pat, it is fun and it's tremendously joyous to get out there and fly an airplane with the confidence that I can go from point A to point B safely, love the view, enjoy the experience, bring my friends along. But that does require some effort on our part, not just in the flight training part, but to stay current afterwards as well. So I hope everybody benefits from this.
Yep, me too. Sometimes you got to fire your students, and that's okay.
Well, with that said, I of course have to tag on. Please click the like button down below. We really appreciate that, as well as the comments you leave down below, because we answer most of them. We love reading them, and sometimes you give us an idea for an episode that we'll do right here on Mad Props. And of course, you should subscribe to the channel. I think there's a new FAR being written about that, there's a notice of proposed rulemaking that you're supposed to subscribe to MadPropsAero. Have you heard about that one, Pat?
No, that's a new one on me, Jamie. It's like not like we need another one.
Uh, well, hey, thanks a lot. I do appreciate y'all. We'll see you back here next time on MadPropsAero. Until then, fly safe, have fun, and take those lessons seriously, whichever seat you're sitting in.
Adios.